Thank you, Cecil. You had me worried there for a moment when you said he's been present at all events in Canadian history. Fortunately, you added for a generation. Sometimes it does feel like being there all along. But it's a great story to tell, the continuing story of this country. It's great to see Lloyd Axworthy again, President Axworthy. We've known each other for 40 years. I covered him in his early days of elected politics, and there were days there that many of us were convinced that one day we'd be calling him Prime Minister Axworthy. President is not bad. You can take that. Let me echo the remarks that Jennifer made about Cecil, who I've known for quite a while as well. He is an amazing journalist, a great manager. Anyone who works for him in his newsroom, when they leave to go somewhere else, recognizes just what a great manager he is. He's taught a whole generation of young journalists at the CBC and others who've gone elsewhere. And as Jennifer said, he literally wrote the book on investigative journalism, not just at the CBC, but in Canada. And he's called upon as a strength to many other organizations as a result of that. And his tireless work in putting this conference together is yet another tribute to Cecil. So thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. Looking around this room, as I did also last night at the reception and met so many of you, I'm humbled to be here. There are journalists here today from all over the world, journalists who have risked everything, journalists who've been in the darkest corners in the world, journalists who've pushed when no one else pushed. I'm in awe of the work that you do. I'm especially in awe of Carl Bernstein, who many of you had the opportunity to meet earlier this morning and will again later this morning. As we all know, Carl's work 40 years ago helped bring down a president. Imagine, bring down a president. I remember it well. I was working here in Winnipeg at that time on the 5th floor of the building next door here. I worked overnights. I was writing the news copy for the morning radio announcers. And every night through that period from the summer of '72 to the summer of '74, one of the most interesting and exciting parts of that overnight shift was waiting to find out what the Washington Post was going to report on the next morning in terms of the Watergate story. And those reports, as you well know, were all done by Carl and Bob Woodward. So those days bring back special memories of not only that story, not only the city, but of Carl Bernstein. So it was great to spend a few moments talking to him. It was a very special time in journalism. Few moments have duplicated it. It didn't just impact our industry, it transformed our industry. Carl and Bob, and yes, they're Hollywood doubles when the movie came out, made a lot of young people want to be journalists. And as a result, thousands went to journalism school. Many journalism schools started in the period following Watergate. Now, I got into this business in 1968, so I should probably thank Carl for his timing more than anything. Because if Watergate had been just a few years earlier, there would have been 200 people lined up for the job that I got, all of them fresh out of journalism school. So I doubt that the CBC would have taken a chance on a baggage handler from Churchill, which is what I was at the time. But in 1968, in northern Manitoba, I was the only one willing to take the job at the only radio station in town. The theme of this conference, you know what it is, you've seen it on all the information you've got, and you've got it on those front of those nice binders, is holding power to account. Now, as we all know, that's a major part of our job as journalists, holding those in power to account. I believe that. I think all of us believe that. Now, holding power to account can be achieved in many different ways: through investigative work, through consistently working a beat, through smart analysis, through digging deeper than what's being presented on the surface, and through persistent interviewing, asking the tough questions, often, again and again. And some of the best interviewers in this country are present in this room today. And one of the things you know about great interviewers is nobody's the same. They all take that task differently. And thank God they do, because if everybody interviewed exactly the same, a defense against strong interviewing would be easy to come up with. When it comes to interviews, I take the long view. Hasn't always been the most popular, but my goal is to get my subject on the record, to have them make statements that they'll then have to account for. For me, as important as the question is, the answer is always paramount. No matter what interviewing approach you take, and as I said, there are many, there are always more questions than there are answers. There always have been, and it's the role of the journalist to ask those questions, all of them. I was just in France, in Normandy. In fact, a week ago right now, I was on those beaches that we all know about. Juneau, Gold, Sword, Utah, Omaha. It was exactly 70 years to the day since D-Day. 70 years since the sacrifice of thousands in the name of freedom. Now, when you walk those beaches and you pass through those cemeteries in Normandy, and I know that some of you have, you can't help but think of those who landed on that day on those beaches. Those who are still with us are pretty old now, the youngest in their late 80s. They remember their friends, and the ones that go back for these anniversaries, you see them walking by themselves on those beaches or through those cemeteries, remembering the brave who died for what now seems an overworked phrase. They died for our freedom. They died so we could enjoy the world we live in today. That phrase has been repeated so many times it's almost become a cliche. Perhaps it doesn't even register with some of us, not anymore. But it's true. They died for freedom. And one of the pillars of freedom is openness. It's a free and open media, a media that doesn't accept, a media that pushes for freedom, pushes for openness. A little over a month ago, I read a headline in one of the largest newspapers in North America. Now, this headline wouldn't shock you if it was telling you a story about China or North Korea or Iran. But it wasn't about any of those countries. It was about this country. It was about Canada. It was in the Toronto Star. It was April 27th. And it was an investigative piece, one of the many that paper does so well. The headline was this: "What Canadians are not allowed to know." And below it, the subheadline: "Public information is cloaked in secrecy." Public information, cloaked in secrecy. Now, what kind of information was the Star talking about? A couple of things. Federal drug safety reviews, railway safety regulations, lists of objects being seized at Canada's borders, the spending of taxpayer money in Afghanistan. The paper went on to make the case that there is a culture of secrecy in Canada's public institutions. A culture of secrecy in Canada. Not China, not North Korea, Canada. Now, not to put too fine a point on this, but that is not what those guys died for on those beaches. As journalists, we exist to tell our audiences the basic information about the day. You know, what's happened, what's good, what's bad, what's bizarre. But we're also here for that headline, to break that culture of secrecy. That's the purpose of investigative journalism, to inform, to reveal, to expose, to explain. Whether it's offshore tax havens, temporary foreign workers, or government surveillance, all great stories broken in the last year. Our attempt to hold government to account is a cornerstone of what we do. There have been some exceptional examples of that in this past year in this country. I just mentioned a couple, but there's more. The ongoing and troubling Rob Ford story, led day in and day out by the Toronto Star. The twists and turns of the robocalls investigation, led by Post Media. The CBC showed that homegrown terrorism is resulting in major and deadly incidents overseas. And of course, CTV's tireless work on the Duffy Wright affair, without a doubt the most serious scandal to have hit the Harper government since it was elected in 2006. Our commitment as journalists is as strong as ever. Access to information requests were up 27% last year compared to the previous one. We are doing our job. But you have to wonder if we're at a crossroads in investigative journalism with headlines like this one. Came from the Globe and Mail in April. CBC trims budget of Quebec investigative program. Trims? Actually, Enquête could lose 1/5 of its staff in these latest round of cuts. Some of you may not know about Enquête. Enquête's the program that first busted open corruption in Quebec politics and construction contracts. Even witnesses in the ongoing Charbonneau Commission have been speaking out against the cuts to the CBC. Without Enquête, it's very likely that everyone involved in that scandal would just be carrying on as if, nothing was wrong. Nobody would have lost their jobs. Nobody would have had to resign from mayor's offices. No big commission would be going on with people testifying behind screens and disguised. So without Enquête, we never would have known about this. And my company, my corporation, the CBC, the public broadcaster who has a mandated interest in investigative journalism, who boasts that we have more investigative journalists than any other media organization. This is where we're cutting back. We should be investing more in these programs, not cutting them. When Cease asked me to speak, he said something that really stuck with me when I was thinking of what I wanted to say. He wrote me an email. He said this: "It's a measure of the seriousness of any news organization that even when economic times get tough, they continue to invest in investigative work." Now, I want to believe that this is still the case, that our organizations still believe in the fundamental need for this kind of work. But we all know that tough decisions, tough choices are being made right now. It's a credit to the English news division of the CBC that managers have been able to limit cuts to its investigative programs. I choose my words carefully. Limit. Didn't say prevent. I can't help but worry about the situation that we're facing. I'm not the only one. We're all worried. Lyndon McIntyre's here. He's so concerned. one of the top investigative journalists, not just in Canada, but in North America. He's so concerned with the cuts to our programs and staff that he's stepping aside to try and ease some of the pain. Now, his departure makes investigative reporting a visible victim of the cuts that are taking place. These are difficult times, and I recognize that they are filled with difficult choices, and difficult decisions are being made at the CBC. But let's be clear, this isn't just about the CBC. All of news, television, radio, print, digital, online, we're all facing cuts. Consider this list pulled from the headlines of the past year. March 2013, Toronto Star announces big cuts, 21 jobs lost in the newsroom. July, Sun Media eliminates 360 jobs. August, layoffs hit Bell Media. November, Post Media to cut 200 jobs. Rogers lays off 94 in media division. There's more. January, National Post, Globe and Mail announce layoffs. April, CBC cuts 657 jobs. Now, I recognize these aren't all in the news divisions of these organizations, but some are, many are. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and we're bleeding. Cutting resources to a news service will eventually hurt every branch of the organization. It impacts the effectiveness of each of us to do our work. Our people, whether in daily news, investigative work, or features, don't exist in a vacuum. You cut one part, everybody is affected. You cut Enquête, we're affected on the English side. We do co-productions with Enquête. We've learned lots from Enquête. We've benefited from their great work. Now, all this is happening at the same time we're also facing a new breed of journalism. The pressure to be faster, the pressure to be first, those aren't new, but add to the mix that someone with a smartphone and a Twitter account thinks they have the scoop of the century, and you get a dangerous combination. Essentially, no verification, no context, very few facts, and stories appearing on Facebook for everyone to rush to judgment before any real journalism has been done. That's not investigative journalism. But in today's world, there's a real danger of confusion. It makes our job both harder, while at the same time more important. To be able to cut through the noise in the social media age, an age where communications officers and PR pros often outstrip the number of journalists and often have bigger budgets, much bigger. An age where spin has become an even more sophisticated art, and where time and money are constantly shrinking on our side. Investigative journalism is not easy. It's never been easy. It's like an archaeological dig, sifting through layers and layers. Layers of dirt, not knowing what you'll find, if you find anything. Like the archaeologist, the investigative journalist doesn't take things at face value, goes deeper, spends hours, days, months on the painstaking details. It can be thankless, it can be lonely, it can be frustrating. It can lead to more questions than answers. And sometimes it can lead to nothing. But sometimes the payoff can be huge. So in these frustrating times, what do? How do we work from here in this new reality where we're expected to do more with less? Well, you know, this weekend is a great start. Take, for example, the rest of this morning. Immediately after this, you'll have a chance to hear from two very different perspectives. In one room, you'll have the team from Enquête. They're living through this unfortunate new reality right now. They're going to share their experiences and the dangers they face in covering high-level crime and corruption. Down the hall, you'll hear one of the rawest examples of why what we do is so important. David Milgaard. David Milgaard spent 23 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He's got some thoughts on our role in covering the wrongfully convicted. I suggest we all listen very carefully. Do you think now for a moment that any of these folks are going to give up pursuing truth? That they're going to stop asking tough questions? That they'll give up fighting for human rights? Not to be overdramatic, but there are lives at stake in what we do. So no matter how tough things get, we know we're going to keep going. Lastly, please consider this. We're in a competitive business. We all know that. We love it, actually. Competing programs, competing networks, competing newspapers. We all want to get to that story. But while we're here in Winnipeg, let's challenge ourselves to put our inherently competitive nature aside for just a moment. Because, you know, we're at a critical point. What you do, what you believe in, is being threatened. Not by our subjects. We've battled and bested them time and again. But in too many cases, by our own organizations. By that pressure to keep up with a 24-hour news cycle, by resources being pulled back, by growing expectations to feed multiple platforms, and by stories and assignments being dictated by clicks rather than substance. Given everything we're up against, it may be the fight of our lives to make sure that we continue to be able to do this kind of work the way we want to do it. To make sure that our viewers, our listeners, our readers do know what they're not allowed to know. This fight isn't about making our jobs easier. It's about the fundamental rights that those guys were willing to die for 70 years ago. That people all over the world are still willing to die for. The idea that journalism is under threat is a much sadder event for our society than it is for you or me. It hurts our viewers, our listeners, and our readers. It hurts them much more than it hurts us. This conference is a time for us to come together. What's clear in the challenges that we face is that we need to support one another in what we do, which is what makes this weekend pretty special. Over the next 3 days, you're going to hear from some of the best in the business from around the world. You'll hear stories that inspire you, stories that make you cringe, stories that you'll wish you'd found. You'll hopefully find friendship in a field that can at times be quite isolating. Take it all in. Soak up as much information as you can. Learn as many lessons as possible. Make a connection with someone new. And celebrate your achievements. Because you should be proud of what it is you do. Investigative journalism has toppled governments. It's infiltrated and exposed organized crime. And it's exonerated the wrongfully convicted. It's held institutions of power to account. It's a cornerstone of our society, and it's vital to the strength of our democracy. But you all know that. That's why you're here. It's why you do what you do. Investigative journalism is an art. It takes skill, perseverance, smarts, and courage. What we do, what you do, matters. It matters to Canadians. It matters to our democracy. It mattered to those men and women 70 years ago. They had the courage to fight for the ideals that we live by, for a free and open society. We must have the courage to honor that. We must have the courage to keep on pushing. And you know what? Courage is contagious. Enjoy the weekend. Thanks very much.